Hey everyone, it's Jacob here, host of the show. It's been a bit since the last episode, but that doesn't mean I haven't been working on it. If you're dealing with a couple of personal issues as well as technical issues, I finally finished the new episode, so thank you all for bearing with me. While I was growing up, I always had the feeling that I wanted to do something in this world that I felt mattered and would impact people and the culture of my generation and the generations to come. Yeah, I know it seems like a crazy thing for a 16-year-old to be dreaming about, but it really was, and I'm still trying to realize that dream today in the form of My Art is Real in this very podcast. Today's guest never set out to change the world or impact the culture, but somehow through a series of events, it ended up being the curator for one of today's most well-established and respected galleries of new contemporary art. I'm your host, Jacob Johnson. This is the My Art is Real podcast, episode 16, Andrew. Right after the break. This episode is brought to you by the Beautiful Bazaar Art Prize. If you are an artist, now is the time to enter the contest and showcase your work on their international platform and have a chance to win $50,000 in prize money. You have until midnight on July 17th, LA time, to enter the contest. To enter and find all the information, go to beautifulbazaarartprize.art. If you enjoy the podcast and want even more content while supporting us, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/myartisreal and sign up today for only $3 a month. That's less than 1 cent a day. Thank you for your support and enjoy the episode.
I'm Andrew Hosner. I'm one of the co-owners. There's three of us, and the head curator, Thinkspace. I'm 53, maybe 54 actually. Just had a birthday, and we've been doing this for coming up on 18 years now. We opened up back in the fall of 2005.
While Thinkspace is a huge part of Andrew's life, I want to go back and learn more of who he was before Thinkspace and discover what kind of person he was growing up. So where did you grow up exactly?
I grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, kind of like the lower left corner of the mitten, as people show you Michigan. Is the normal thing to do in the Midwest, but it was like literally known as like the halfway point between Chicago and Detroit, because a lot of businesses went back and forth between the two centers. And that's kind of where I grew up and got my culture. I would go to Detroit for like metal concerts and stuff. I was a metalhead, and then would go and get sports and other culture in Chicago, because my dad was a Cubs fan. So I would probably be going to Chicago about probably about 4 or 5 times a year. And then also, probably headed up to Detroit probably about 10 times a year for concerts and stuff like that at Harpo's and this other shithole called Todd's, I think it was. And yeah, and that's just right outside of Battle Creek too, is where Kalamazoo was. And like Kalamazoo back then, they have these like little, it was like a whole campaign, like, yes, there really is a Kalamazoo, and there's t-shirts and like little buttons and everything, and that was big time in like the 70s and early 80s. So it's funny, like up until like the 90s, I would still like, people are like, oh, that Kalamazoo? I'm like, yeah, that Kalamazoo.
As an only child born to 2 school teachers, Andrew had a pretty good childhood. He was always a collector of sorts, which seems to come from his father. He and his dad had a great relationship, and they would spend quite a lot of time together, going to Cubs games and the flea market to collect new antiques and baseball cards, and much more.
So I was always a collector. Like I started out probably collecting like, and I guess like probably, I mean, I remember having a lot of Hot Wheels, and then graduated to baseball cards, and actually comic books. And then I got sick of comic books. And then my dad was always like a big antique person and political buttons collector. So he was constantly kind of like one of those guys that was always like moving and shaking and flipping stuff here and there at flea markets and various things. So he knew there was outlets for things. And I had amassed a pretty good comic book collection, but I had become bored with it and started to collect baseball cards. And he was just like, well, you should sell your comic book collection and buy more baseball cards. And I was like, well, but I ended up getting like multiple thousands of dollars from my comic book collection. Looking back, should have held on to it because I had some gems. But this was like, I'm going to say like early 80s, like 82, 83. And then started, investing and, went really heavy into baseball cards for a good like 4 or 5 years. And it was a way for my dad and I to kind of stay bonded through those weird teenage years. So like from the time I was 13 to 17, I was, in regular, kind of communication with my dad, which I think is kind of unusual for that age. But we just had this thing with, we'd go to flea markets and I'd look for baseball cards and he'd be looking for local buttons. My mom would just tag along, and enjoy the ride, be keeping an eye out for both of us, so to speak.
Growing up as a kid, were you outgoing? Like, was it very easy for you to make friends, or were you shy? What were you like, kind of growing up?
Super shy, super shy. And on top of that, I had red hair. So I mean, back then it wasn't cool to have red hair. It seems to be almost kind of cool to be a ginger these days. But and my parents were both teachers in the same school system that I was going to school in. So yeah, I didn't have the greatest childhood in terms of just that. I mean, I had a great childhood in terms of like my parents were awesome, super spoiled, and like what I wanted and got because I was an only child and whatnot. But I mean, in terms of, I mean, I had like maybe two close buddies when I was younger, and then in my middle school years, I maybe had two close buddies, and I've kept in touch with nobody that I went to high school with.
The clique Andrew was hanging out with didn't have many aspirations in life, and while he didn't know either what he wanted to do, his parents, being teachers, made it very clear that he should go to college. And so he did. He signed up to take marketing classes, but before long, he would end up being offered a job he just couldn't refuse.
I started college, and then I started doing college radio and doing like the Friday Night Metal show. And from there, that led me to get in pretty tight with the Relapse Records crew, which is like a metal grindcore label out of the Philly area that's been around for probably about 25 years now. And at the time, they were just starting to get their shit together and like thinking about starting to like, have a promo department and stuff like that. And I was like maybe 6 months into a horrible college career where I just could tell I did not want to do another 3.5 years of it. And I was going to school for marketing at the time, just figuring it's kind of broad reaching and I could figure something out. And these guys, Matt that ran Relapse back in the day, just kept talking to me, and we were keeping in touch, and then ended up getting a job at a local music store on top of running the radio show. And I started like doing a lot of the metal buying. I started a little metal department there where you got all the LPs and CDs would be in one section and stuff like that. And that just further ingratiated me with Relapse. And then they offered me they're like, hey, do you want to come out and start your career? And I was like maybe 20. And my mom was totally freaked out about the notion of me moving from Michigan out to Pennsylvania. But I've always had pretty supportive folks, and they went for it, and they gave me some money, and I moved out there on a whim, and ended up working for them for, gosh, man, maybe 10 or 11 years.
It was at this job that Andrew was able to travel the world, and doing all this traveling really opened his eyes to more parts of the world and more ideas of thinking.
Started doing like international sales for them, and I got to go to like London, Nice, which is in France, and forgetting where in Germany right now. Crazy. But anyways, in Germany, like a couple times a year, each of those places for about 5 or 6 years, I was doing international sales, and then I moved on to some other things at the label. But that just really opened up my worldview, and started going to like amazing museums all around the world and stuff like that.
How did it feel for you to be so young and already kind of in your career and doing this incredible job and traveling in your early 20s? I mean, how did that feel?
Oh, it's dope, man. Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it's just made me a better person for sure. If I didn't get to do all that traveling and see all that stuff when I was in my early 20s, I think it definitely kind of changed a lot of my worldview. And I mean, my folks and I will argue all the time about shit just because, I mean, they've got that closed-minded kind of Midwestern view on things sometimes, and then I'd look back and remember some of the stuff my grandma would say, and I'd be like, oh, God, Grandma.
Andrew never seemed to think too much ahead, never worried too much about dating and getting married and starting a family. He figured he would just let life happen, and sure enough, his now wife, Sean, came into his life.
Met my wife. She was working at our distributor for the label. We were just buddies for the longest time. And then one thing led to another. And I think like the summer of 2001, I came out here to see her and just see if we clicked, see what would happen. And ended up like really like hitting it off. And I was supposed to fly back the morning of 9/11, true story. And we woke up, and we're sitting there laying in bed, like watching everything unfold. She kind of looked at me and she's like, "You're not getting on a flight today." And I'm like, "I bet you there's no flights today if I wanted to get on one." And then, of course, within minutes, my mom's calling me like, "Aren't you supposed to fly today? You're not getting on." I'm like, "Mom, I don't think there's going to be any flights today." And then for sure enough, there weren't any flights for a number of days. I think within a day or two of that happening, we were out and about, and ended up going to see a show at the Troubadour. And to this day, I can't remember who the fuck it was. Neither can my wife, but some metal show we went to just because I'm like, oh, I was still in town, might as well go. And the guys from Century Media were there, who was like a competing metal label, and they saw me and they were just like, "Oh, what are you doing out here?" And I kind of told them, and one of them I'm pretty good at the time. I was pretty good buddies with, so I was being a little bit more open with him and told him that I'm like, I kind of falling for Sean's, be pretty cool and stuff. And he's just like, well, "What are you gonna do? You work at Relapse?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, Matt's hinted at the fact that I could do a home office if I wanted to. I think he was starting to get the wind that I was thinking about doing something. And I don't know. I just didn't have the. I don't know. I just couldn't see doing like a one guy in a bedroom type thing without the vibe of an office. Just wasn't me. And Century Media kind of offered like, "Hey, why don't you come in tomorrow and talk with us?" And I was like, "Oh, crazy!" I'm like, "That's an interesting little ripple." So I did. Ended up staying like an extra week more with Sean because we were really hitting it off. And then by the time it was time to fly back to Pennsylvania, she ended up. We had made it all the plan that I was going to pretty much go back, break it to them that I was leaving, and then she'd come back. She'd fly in like about 3-4 days later, and then help me pack up, and then we drive out here with all my stuff, and that's basically what we did. Because I knew once I told them they were going to want me the heck out, especially if I was going to Central. Yeah, and they did. They weren't too happy about it. Looking back, understandably so.
As we said at the beginning of this episode, Andrew was always a collector at heart. From comic books to then baseball cards, Andrew then got into heavy metal and soon began collecting heavy metal posters and memorabilia. But somewhere along the way, he finally got into collecting artworks.
Like I was saying, once I started traveling Europe and things like that, and just getting exposed to more and more art, I started filling up my personal apartment with like Mucha prints and Dolly prints and things like that. So like the first time my wife came over to visit me, like when we were just dating, and saw my apartment in Philly, she was kind of blown away because she was just like, "I was expected beer signs and metal, posters." And I'm like, "Oh, well, 3 years ago you would have saw that, but I'm growing up." But she was super impressed by that, and she was like really into Barry McGee. Like she knew a little bit more about the juxtaposed side of things than I did at the time. And then when I moved out here, that's when we really started like going to art shows all the time. And then within like 6 months ago, going out to art shows pretty regularly, we decided that we both had some prints and this that, and another thing. Maybe it was time to start buying some originals, and we had both gotten pretty good jobs, and yeah, we slowly started buying originals, and you know the rest is history, as they say. We now got like 500 or 600 pieces. But I mean, my like our house is covered floor to ceiling, but then people that know us from like when we were kids get it because like Sean's mom was like similar, but just with like kitschy, like kind of Midwest, Southwest type artworks and horse stuff and things like that, and like little knickknacks everywhere. And her mom and grandma made quilts all the time, so the house was just filled with everything. And my folks were like massive antique collectors, and like literally floor to ceiling, just everywhere. And like and when I started, loving Kiss, my room was floor to ceiling Kiss posters everywhere. And then when I transitioned to comic books, it was floor to ceiling like framed comics, and then it was floor to ceiling framed like baseball cards and framed and autographed posters, and autographed pictures of baseball players and stuff like that. And then it slowly started transitioning. When I moved out on my own, it was just like a lot of just metal posters and stuff like that. But again, I mean, looking back, it was always art, I guess, in some form or another, even if I didn't really realize it at the time.
What's most important about the way that Andrew and his wife collect artworks is that they're not trying to get some work that they believe is going to grow in value and they can flip and make a profit. They collect works purely for the love of the art, for the love of the find, and they just want to share these works with people who come into their home and people who come into their office. Like, they just want to share it with the world.
My wife and I never have had kids. We're both in our mid-50s now. We're not naive enough to think we're going to have them now, or would we even want to do that to ourselves at this age? So our art collection's kind of like our legacy, I mean, at least our name will be somewhere in a museum somewhere for many years to come if we do it right. I mean, and that's our plan. I mean, we've never picked anything. We've got a pretty good rep amongst galleries because there's so many collectors and I get it. It's part of what the art world is. I mean, it's ultimately a commodities type portfolio building adventure for a lot of people. But we've always bought just for the pure love of buying art. I mean, we'll buy something from a huge blue chip artist, on Friday, and the next day we're out at like some, studio, some up and coming artist who might not ever, paint one thing after they get out of college, but we love it. It makes us smile, so we'll buy it. And those type of things hang next to each other in every room of our house, and here in my office here at the gallery that I'm talking to you, because people come in my office all the time and it's filled with art.
Andrew never had dreams of being a gallery owner or even an art curator. All of that was sort of just a natural progression of what he and his wife are doing as art lovers. They would spend a lot of time in LA just going around to different openings looking for art to collect. And at that time, it was harder to find out about these new shows, but Andrew would do his best to keep track and ended up with a list of all the shows he wanted to attend. And they would just attend a bunch of them that month or whatever.
At the time, my wife and I were becoming, like I said, we were becoming pretty ardent collectors. And due to that, I was like kind of I've always been super anal retentive and super like overly organized, as my wife will say, and a massive list keeper. I love keeping lists and scratching things off. It's just one of my joys. I was creating a pretty intense list of what shows I wanted to go to each week, because back then, Juxtapoz didn't even have a website. And they'd come out quarterly back then. And at the bottom of the opening night photos that they used to share back then, there'd be like this little bitty, like maybe 7 font listing of like all the shows that were coming up for the next couple months, because, those were the more underground shows. And it's not like these galleries were, really advertising like some of the, the bigger galleries in town were. So it was easier to figure out what was going on. So you had to really kind of have your ear to the pavement, take notes and stuff. And a buddy at my label I was at Relapse at the time was just like, he was into art, and I started sharing it with him, and he was just like, man, this is a pretty cool comprehensive list that you put together each week. We should start sharing it with somebody. And he was cool enough to like start like a little web page for me. We were big collectors of Brendan Monroe at the time, and he was doing this little bitty zine back then that was all around his little sour character, and he called it Sour Harvest. And I was just like, man, I love that name. Do you mind if I use that name for my art blog? And he was just like, yeah, man, I'll even do a little logo for you. And I was like, dude, you rule. And we started like making little postcards that said like, for all the latest underground shows, come check out sourharvest.com. And, within about a month, maybe I'd say about 3-4 months, we had like, a couple thousand people on our mailing list. We had a little sign up list. And it was getting to be where like people see us out and about at shows and see us putting down the postcards, and they're like, "Are you guys Sour Harvest?" And my wife and I would be like, "Yeah." They're like, "Oh, we're here tonight because of you. We saw it on your site." And it started becoming like a thing. And after about a year, we were building momentum. And like 1988 Gallery had opened, and they were putting us on the back of each of their postcards for their shows, just to kind of be like, for other things in the LA art world, be sure to check out Sour Harvest. And then we curated a couple little shows around town. And so, anyways.
One of these underground shows that they would often attend was put on by a little art group called Cannibal Flower, which was by one of Thinkspace's co-founders, LC.
We were going to a lot of the Cannibal Flower events, and Cannibal Flower is, it's still an entity. He does some things here and there. But back then, there was that big, like, kind of warehouse fire in San Francisco, like sometime around like the mid 2000s. I don't know if you remember, but like at the time that like just made like live work artist lofts kind of became like impossible. And a lot of real estate people that dealt with warehouses and stuff just stopped dealing with like short-term rentals and stuff like that. But before that, in the heyday of like Cannibal Flower, and there was another one back then called Create Fixate. But basically they were like a once a month art rave, for lack of a better term, even though they're far removed from what a rave is today. But basically, LC and the girl that you would do Create Fixate back then, they realized that there was a shortage of places for up and coming artists. That there was a lot of places for established artists and artists that like, went to, the Pasadena School of Design and all the proper places, but like, the self-taught downtown, kind of punk rock artists, there wasn't a whole lot of outlets. And at the time, LC was actually working at La Luz de Jesus as a cashier, and he constantly saw how many people were coming in to show Billy their work and were leaving all bummed out that, Billy either didn't like it or, was just too busy and couldn't take them on. So LC with a friend there at La Luz was just like, fuck, man, we should just start some sort of pop-up crazy event, and LC was always into music and his partner was too. So basically they started Cannibal Flower, and And like I was saying, just once a month he would find through his contacts, and as Cannibal Flower grew, I think people just knew who it was, and they were like, "Oh yeah, sure, come on in and use the spot." And I think realtors looked at it as it was getting a bunch of people into their spot to check it out. Maybe they might rent it or something. And he would get permission to have the spot for like a couple days, and he'd come in and hang the show like Saturday afternoon, and then Saturday night. I mean, there'd be like it was usually anywhere from 80 to 100 artists. Um, and then probably 3 or 4 performances, a couple bands, and $10 to get in, got you 2 beers, and then each additional beer was like $5 or something like that. And I'd say back in its heyday, I mean, there would always be 3 to 4, 500 people at each one, and it's just a great like super like LA moment, moment in time. There's nothing like it now, and I don't think you could ever recreate the vibe. Um, but like so many of like the huge artists of today, they're starting there. There's so many artists that can say they still showed a Cannibal Flower back in the day. It's kind of wild. And my wife and I just became like regular patrons. We would go to almost every one, and almost every show we'd buy something because you could always walk away with something pretty rad for 2, 3, 4, 500 bucks.
It was then one day that Andrew, Sean, and LC ended up hanging out and chatting with each other. At the time, it didn't feel like much, but that chat would end up being the moment that would lead to the creation of Thinkspace and one of the most important things in all of their lives.
In early 2005, he got the opportunity to have this little bitty spot off of Melrose, and he called it Art Annex. And he had done maybe 3, 4 shows there. We were there one day hanging out. We were picking up a piece that we had bought from Ikundayo, an artist that we still work with to this day. And he had the piece there to pick up, so we went there to pick it up, and we were just hanging out talking. And it was a cool little spot. I mean, like the size of like I think it was maybe 250 square feet. And he was telling us that a friend had the property for a number of years and was letting them rock it. And we're like, oh, cool. And we're just sitting there shooting shit. And a fellow artist friend of ours today by the name of Nathan Sport, who's still active and showing to this day, real cool surrealist, pop surrealist artist, was hanging out there with us. And so as we're sitting there hanging out, with LC that day at the Art Annex, Nathan Spore was just like, well, why don't you guys like combine your powers? He's just like, you guys, have a great eye. You've already got a great website, with Sour Harvest, this and the other thing. And you've got a great following there. And you've already know all the artists and you have a lot of buyers already, but it seems like but he just wasn't very business minded, so to speak. And at the time, we didn't really know what we were doing in terms of like hanging an art show or stuff like that, whereas he was hanging one every week for years. So we just kind of were like, this could be cool, and we were just sitting there hanging out, having a smoke and shooting shit. And then Nathan's like, man, you guys should just team up, yeah. And we were like, maybe, and he's just like, why don't you guys take over the spot called Thinkspace? And we all just kind of looked at each other like, kind of cool, and we kind of started vibing on the name and stuff. And within like a week, it just became a reality. And then like these 2 girls, Nicole and Suzette, that are still in our world, and Suzette still helps us with the website to this day. But that we didn't even really know. We, in retrospect, we like once we started talking to them and stuff on MySpace and stuff back farther going, we found out that they're like, oh no, remember we met you that one night at the 1988 benefit show, blah blah. And we're like, oh yeah, we remember you guys are blah blah. But they got wind that we were doing this, and then they hit us up one day out of the blue, but the way their wording was so awkward that they were basically like, hey, man, we heard you're starting to think, blah, blah, blah. We got the website for you. But the way we read it, we thought they were like trying to, like, that was in the early days of the .coms. And there was a lot of like, buying websites and trying to, and we're like, fuck, is somebody trying to do that to us? And then it was funny but then we opened up a conversation with them, and they were like, no, we were worried somebody was going to do that to you, and we noticed that you hadn't secured the name yet, so we got you your .com, blah blah. And we're like, oh, you guys rule. And then they were both just programmer type girls, so they gave us a lot of pointers on what to do early out, and they helped us made sure that we got our MySpace locked in right away and this that and the other thing. And then they ended up buying us our first sign for the first gallery. And no, they've been family ever since. But it was just one of those, like, the community back then was so strong that once we really started kind of getting it all going, the buzz on us was crazy. And then when we opened our first show, we had Mir One, who's like a legend, painting a huge piece on one side of our gallery. And then on the back of the gallery, we had Buff Monster painting a mural, and he had a girl that he was dating at the time that was in the adult film industry, helping him. And she was pretty much naked most of the night. Like, so it was just a spectacle. And we had like shut down most of Melrose, and the side street that we were on was completely blocked. And there was probably like, I mean, I would say like if we packed people arm to arm, that gallery would have held maybe 40 people. And there was probably like 500 people there. We just, Elsie started spinning in the back lot. The people on the balconies across the street were out like partying and shouting down, and like, just interacting with the crowd. I mean, it became a thing. And then we were kind of like, maybe this is what we were meant to do.
But as soon as they started to build up this steam and this momentum, the space they were using was just taken away from them. And they were left struggling to figure out where they were going to curate their lineup of shows.
5 months into it, the guy that was letting LC rent the space, who we had never even met, to be honest, didn't even know his fucking name. It was just like how stupid we were, to be honest, looking back. One day where we weren't even there, LC just calls us up and is like, yo, man, this dude just came in, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember his name, Mark, let's call him. And he told me that he wants the spot back at the end of the month, that he's going to give it to his wife, and she's going to turn it into a hair salon, which oddly enough, to this day, 17 years later, it's still a hair salon. So God bless her, she did well. But I was just drove by about maybe 2 months ago, and I was baffled. I'm like, wow, she's still great. But anyways, we were just like, what? And I was like, dudes, I'm sorry, man. It just wasn't meant to be. And it was just kind of like a maybe it wasn't meant to be type thing. And I was just like, fuck that. And literally like a week prior, one of the artists that we work with, Leslie Repito, had just curated a show, the front part of Logan Hicks' studio, who's a really world-renowned stencil artist who's still like really popular to this day. And it was out in Silver Lake. And I was just like, and that's just, for some reason, it just popped in my head. And I'm just like, man, maybe he would just let us do a couple shows in there like he did for Leslie. And I was just looking for something like a Band-Aid at that point, because I knew we weren't going to be able to find a spot right away. And June was going to be our first show with Lola, who now is known as Lola Gill and just got signed by, I think, Nicodeme. She's huge now, but we ended up doing her first couple solo shows. But this was to be her first solo show. It was booked and everything. And I mean, I think at the time, if I remember correctly, we did her first ad in Juxtapose. And then all of a sudden we didn't have a gallery. And we were just like, what the fuck? And I was just like, I think my ego just wasn't going to let me like declare defeat. And I was just like, I got to at least go out. And I just cold drove out. I remember hitting up Leslie, and she was just like, just go out there. It's just going to be your best bet. And I just drove out and knocked on the door. Logan answered the door and told him my story and what was up. And, he's like, remembered me and knew who Thinkspace was. He had heard like the buzz and stuff. And he's like, so what are you asking? And I kind of pitched it to him, and he's just like, how about this? He's like, how about I clean out the front? You guys have the front. I'll keep all my stuff in the back, and we just split rent. And he's like, that would help me out immensely. And we were like, fucking amazing, and we did that. And for about I'd say maybe 6 months, that was the scenario. And then he ended up deciding to move to New York and get married and start a family, which is what he's done. And he was like, you guys want to, take over the lease? He's just like, I got this lease for a song. I think it's like, they were paying $1,000 a month back then or something like that. It's crazy. But also 15 years ago. But, and we were like, fuck yeah. And then at that point, that's when we really started to go for it. And then really, then we got the doers, the girls shook up. And, for a couple of years, things were just going crazy out there.
Thinkspace quickly grew and became a big deal out in LA with huge exhibitions and different parties. And they also grew outside of that by advertising in magazines like Juxtapose and using social media. They were able to build a pretty large audience around the world.
Like our first really big group show, Picks of the Harvest, that was like it became an annual thing for a number of years. But LA Times gave us a big write up on that when we were still out in Silver Lake, and just to really kind of hype just how different it was, because it just had every style under the planet and all sizes next to big sizes and salon style and stuff like that. We're always baffled when we do something anywhere outside LA and people know us. I mean, I know that we've advertised in Expos and we've done our due diligence over the years, but still, I mean, there's 8 billion people in the fucking world, and I mean, there's 20 new artists that catch my eye every day. So even when I think I'm like fucking killing it, I'm just like, Jesus Christ. I mean, it's impossible to keep up. So when we're like the gallery or like doing an art fair in London or doing an event in Berlin or whatever, we just did a big show in Hong Kong, and people are just like buzzing and loving, and I fucking love following you guys, blah, blah, blah. it's still baffling to me. I try to remain humble. I think maybe that keeps us grounded and stuff. I mean, we've had offers over the years to open up in Japan and Hong Kong and New York and everything like that, and we've just always said no. We just feel that if it's not us and not our vibe, even if we're curating, it's just got to be the family that it is. I mean, we've had the same director now for 11 or 12 years. Anthony, our graphics and warehouse manager, has been with us since day one. He was one of the, I mean, he's even been in almost every group show since day one. I mean, well, a lot of people that were in our first group show are still showing with us to this day.
And how does it feel with your curation now? Does it feel like something you were meant to do?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very blessed to do it because I mean, like what we do changes people's lives. I mean, to a great degree. I mean, and when my wife had when we shared with the world that, she had stage 4 cancer a few months ago, I mean, it was kind of wild because most people don't get their flowers ever, when they're alive. Um, so many people sent us notes of just mind blowing notes. Especially, I mean, more good for her, but a lot of it was, you guys. I mean, and even if not, I mean, just seeing the love for her, but just how many people just wrote to us saying that you guys changed our lives. I mean, people we hadn't heard from in like 10 years. Uh, sorry.
Oh, you're good, man. You're good.
That was wild, man. She's fighting it, and she's an amazing person, but it was pretty crazy how many people reached out and just were like, man, I just want you guys to know what you did for me. And it's just something you don't usually hear. And no, so the last like few months have been pretty special all around. And now that she's kind of, getting as good as can with stage 4, but I mean, everything is looking great. Like your markers are down and no new growth and stuff. We're doing all sorts of alternative remedies, Eastern stuff, and doing all sorts. And there's lots of stories from some of the stuff we've done where people beat it. So we're holding on to that. But regardless, now that we're back out in the mix, it's out there, so to speak. I mean, people that are just coming up to us at shows and events and stuff that I don't know. We counted them as friends. I don't know how to put it, but that are just coming up and sharing so much love that it's just really kind of like, wow, this is what we were meant to do. I mean, we've known that for a long time, but now to like really, I mean, just to have heard like probably in the last few months, there's hundreds of stories of people that are just really being honest and just like, whoa, dude, it's like if you wouldn't have done this, and this wouldn't have happened for me. And then when you keep reading it and reading it, and you're just like, wow, fuck, man, that's kind of heavy. It's pretty dope.
Often, people don't come and tell you how much you mean to them while you're alive. It's a shame that more people don't say these things to each other while they still can. So for Andrew and Sean to not only have so many come to them with all this love, but to have it come from people that they have inspired and changed through building this gallery and these incredible shows, it's just mind-blowing. For Andrew and Sean and everyone else at Thinkspace, it's more than just a gallery. It's a legacy. They want to help and support artists and change the art world in the best way they can.
Because, I mean, this is our legacy, and it's going to be her legacy when she is gone. So, yeah, the more I can do, especially with museums and stuff, because that's always been my thing. We've done art fairs, but we kind of all hit a wall like right before COVID, and then with not having done them now for a couple of years, we're like, man, none of us miss them. They just bend you over, and it's just like a fucking shopping mall art. I mean, it's for that part of the art world that we just hate that we were talking about earlier. I mean, it's built to be a churn and burn, and it's also built to be able to have a young artist be like $5,000 in January, and then by the time you hit December and you've done 10 fairs in 10 different cities, all of a sudden that $5,000 piece is $50,000. And I've seen it, and because we started paying more attention to it the last couple of years because our collecting changed a little bit because we were just curious and wanted to dabble a little bit because we had just a couple collector friends that were just like, just buy a couple things that I tell you to. And I'm like, if I like them, sure. And we did a couple times, and then you're just like, what the fuck? It's amazingly unbelievable to watch. And in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of artists that are, kind of on just the tail end of that comet, so to speak. And then recently, like Roby Duiantono had his big solo show with us. And then, the show was barely a year and a half ago. And pieces from that show that were like $2,500 now flipped for like $30,000 to $35,000. I mean, it's we kind of joked, damn, I wish I would have bought 4 or 5. But at the same time, we wouldn't flip them. That's just not who we are. And and we're comfortable. We don't need to be bougie. We don't need a bigger house. Our house is filled with amazing art. We got great cats, and we're happy. We don't have a lot of money in the bank, but I mean, we probably got a few $1 million on the walls if we ever did want to sell it. But I don't see that happening. And our goal is to leave it all to a museum. I mean, so because like I said, like I was saying earlier, that's going to be our legacy. And as long as we can, you know, I was just going to say stay healthy, but that's kind of sucks since everything that's going on with Sean. But I mean, thankfully we've got really good insurance and it hasn't like bankrupted us. But with that said, we just did a big cancer charity just because we wanted to at least use what's happening to her as like some sort of vehicle to help others. And we were able to raise. I mean, we're doing all the math on that show right now because it just came down. But I mean, I think we're raised a good $25,000 to $30,000 or more for cancer research, which some people argue is bullshit, but got to try. So I don't know. I mean, we've always been the life hands you lemons, try to make some lemonade type folks. Over the years, this one was just a blow that none of us were expecting. But it's one of those things that you just kind of like, fuck, have too much of a family, and then you realize that, oh, we're assholes. We have a huge family. It's kind of one of those. It's a great wake up call. I mean, and not. That's a weird way to put it. It was just wild to see like how much the community had her back. Yeah, it was very uplifting.
Talking to Andrew was a breath of fresh air for me personally. It's like I keep saying, when you hear these stories, you start to realize how similar sometimes your story might be to others and what you can relate to. And for me, it was refreshing to hear the story of someone who grew up outside of any kind of major art city and didn't finish college and just followed his heart. Andrew did what he felt made him happy, and no matter where it took him, he made the best of it. And along the way, he was able to build something that changed not only his life, but the lives of so many others. Thank you to everyone for listening and being there to support My Art Drill. I love making this podcast, and I really hope these stories can inspire all of you. This podcast takes so much time and energy to create, as I'm doing everything myself. So if you want to help me produce better and bigger content, please consider supporting me and getting bonus content on the Patreon page at patreon.com/myartistdrill. Thank you for listening to another episode of the My Art Drill podcast. I will see you in the next one.